this kind of thinking anyway is not biblical. This goes against Christian epistemology, which would say that God and his word are the ultimate source of knowledge. Without God, we cannot begin to know anything. We don't rely on ourselves and our own flawed logic and reason for knowledge. We rely on the perfect mind and thoughts of God. Hey, welcome back to Campfire Apologetics. I am Mark Hudson, and this is where I help equip the everyday Christian with tools to help defend their faith in an increasingly hostile culture. But as I grow, it's going to remain an apologetics channel. That's what I want to do, but you can't really do that without getting into theology and other types of issues, because they all kind of run hand in hand. Theology and apologetics, they're, I personally don't think you can really have one without the other, or at least you can't be a good apologist unless you study theology and have a good handle on that. So today, anyway, on this episode, I wanted to focus on Christian epistemology. I personally I find this super interesting. It's a really interesting subject, and as I study, it's becoming more and more of an area of interest for me. So in exploring this idea, I'm going to use a couple popular philosophical, basically just sayings that are you've probably heard, and I'm going to try to break them down from the viewpoint of Christian epistemology, or how a Christian should probably view these things. First, I'm going to unpack Descartes' saying, "I think, therefore I am." And then second, I want to tackle Berkley's example of a tree falling in the woods. It's kind of a thought experiment that he came up with. And then finally, I want to show why only the Christian epistemology can make sense of reality, make sense of these things. It's the only thing that can ground logic and induction and sound and physics and all these other things. So these kinds of exercises, they help us think through these things. And, when we hear them, and giving particular examples that I'm going to use, I think it's going to help maybe be able to pick out certain worldview assumptions as you have conversations in the real world. And I've heard both of these many times before. The I think, therefore I am, and then the example of a tree falling in the woods, and if nobody's around, does it make a sound? Those types of things. I've personally heard them a bunch of times, and I've never really given them much thought. Never really thought about the foundational worldview assumptions behind those, and I never really, never understood them from kind of the philosophical side. But as time goes on, I'm learning, and I'm seeing that these things, they do have deep worldview assumptions, and everybody has a worldview assumption. And these things, you can hear people's worldviews coming out when you have conversations with them as they speak. If you listen long enough, you're probably going to pick up on how a person views the world, or what their foundational beliefs are, these types of things. So real quick, I do want to kind of quickly explain what epistemology is. I know I've broken this down on previous episodes, but if you are not familiar with it, if you haven't heard that word, then I'll go ahead and explain it here again. But epistemology it's just a fancy word for the study of knowledge. Essentially, how do you know what you know? What is your starting point or ultimate authority when it comes to knowing anything at all? There's a lot of different epistemologies, But I believe that the only one, which is the Christian epistemology, can make sense of reality. It's the only one that can do that. And so I'm going to give some examples of these different epistemologies. Now, there are more than what I'm going to give you, but I'm not a philosophy PhD or expert or anything of the sort. But I will give some of these and I'll give a brief explanation as to how they view knowledge so that hopefully you have a better grasp of what I'm talking about. A few examples of, again, of these different epistemologies are you have rationalism, you have empiricism and existentialism, pragmatism, and postmodernism. So those are the ones that I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview. Again, there's more. There's more than that, but I'll stick with these just to drive the point home. But rationalists, anyway, they believe that their ultimate authority for knowledge is logic and reason. So before they can begin to know anything at all, they must start with their own abilities to use logic and reason properly. Empiricism relies on experience and sense perception. So what can you see, touch, taste, smell, hear, all those different things? Basically what can be tested in a test tube sort of viewpoint. Existentialism, that relies on lived experience, freedom, angst, and authenticity. What truths are uncovered by lived experience. Pragmatism bases knowledge on what is practical and useful. Essentially, if it works, then it's true and good. That's kind of, like I said, these are all very broad views or broad overview of these things. And then the postmodern epistemology challenges traditional notions of objective truth and universal knowledge. Now, this one is pretty popular in our culture, and you've probably heard things that follow postmodern thought. You've probably heard things like, that's your truth, or that's true for you, but not for me. And so those kinds of statements, again, were born out of postmodern thought. Now, these examples, again, is just to give you a bit of a foundation and understanding of the different types of epistemological or epistemic viewpoints that exist, so that we can, have this conversation and it can make a little more sense. This isn't an attempt really to break down each one of these and show the problems with them. But notice, however, that the starting point in all of these examples is man himself. The self is the foundation for truth. These examples will help you with the philosophical examples that I'm going to give to you. And maybe that will help you to point out what kind of underlying assumptions these particular sayings are pointing to, with, the backdrop of a little bit of understanding there. Okay. The first example I want to talk about is a famous saying by René Descartes. Again, the saying is, I think, therefore I am. Also known as the cogito ergo sum. Descartes found himself in a place of doubting everything, even his own existence. He wanted to find something that ultimately could not be doubted. He wanted to be shown the validity of beliefs, the basic truths that were indisputable. He was systematic in his doubt to the point of doubting or questioning anything that he had ever heard, basically to death. It was an extreme. It was so extreme that he would even question things like whether or not his hand was actually in front of his face as he held it out in front of him. He wasn't even sure of his own senses. Maybe the things that we are seeing and experiencing were hallucinations or even illusions set in place by something wicked to fool him. The one thing that he could not doubt, though, was the fact that he was doubting. Because if you doubt that you are doubting, you are doubting. So it's self-defeating, right? So one thing he knew for sure was that he was doubting. What else must be true in order to doubt? Well, in order to doubt, you must think. So he came to the conclusion that he was doubting, and if he was doubting, then he must necessarily be thinking. So, because doubt is a form of thinking, you can't have doubt without thought. Logically, it followed in his mind that if he was doubting, then he was thinking. And if he was thinking, then someone must exist in order to do the thinking, because thought requires a thinker. If he was thinking and doubting, then he must be. He must exist in order to be the one who is doing the thinking. This could be rephrased as, I doubt, therefore I am. Now, some argue that there's some striking resemblances between Descartes from the 17th century, his thoughts, and the thoughts of Augustine from the 4th century. Augustine was an apologist of his day, and he spent much time refuting the empty philosophies, or the empty philosophies of man from students of Plato. And Plato also spent time refuting other philosophies. So it seems that if man is the arbiter of truth and knowledge, then we run into kind of this infinite regression of the source of knowledge and truth until we get to the point of man's non-existence. Now, we did not invent laws of logic and truth. We discover them. They are immaterial, infinite, and universal. They exist whether man exists or not. So the laws of logic still exist if man does not exist. Augustine said, where these truths are concerned, I fear none of the arguments of the academicians when they say, what if you are in error, basically concerning your existence? If I'm in error, I exist. Someone who doesn't exist surely can't be in error. In light of this fact, I exist if I'm in error. Therefore, since I exist if I'm in error, how can I be in error about my existing when it's certain that I exist if I'm in error? Because I would not, or I would have to exist if I were in error. I am therefore undoubtedly not in error about knowing that I know. For just as I know that I exist, so too I know this very fact, that I know. That's from The City of God in Against the Academicians and the Teacher. Now, that sounded like a kind of a handful, but if you go back and listen to that again, it'll probably make more sense. But, essentially, he could not be in error of his existence unless he existed, because you can't be in error unless you exist. So that's kind of more or less what he was getting at. But now, the difference between Descartes and Augustine, though, is that Augustine used this line of reasoning to refute skeptics of his time. Descartes, on the other hand, he used his thought as his bedrock of epistemology. So this was an epistemology of rationalism. Notice how Descartes came to the conclusion that he must exist because he is thinking. He used his own logic and reason to come to the conclusion that he must exist if he is thinking. On the surface, most people wouldn't really argue this. They'd probably just say, yeah, that makes sense, and then move on. But after thinking on this idea more and more, I came to realize that this kind of thinking, anyway, is not biblical. This goes against Christian epistemology, which would say that God and his word are the ultimate source of knowledge. Without God, we cannot begin to know anything. We don't rely on ourselves and our own flawed logic and reason for knowledge. We rely on the perfect mind and thoughts of God. God is the necessary foundation and precondition for reality. Logic and reason can't make sense or be meaningful unless there is something to ground logic and reason. These things are not material, they are conceptual, and in order for them to be conceptual, they must exist in an infinite, immutable, universal, and perfect mind, the mind of God. Proverbs 1:7, which I have said many, many, many times, but it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fool starts with himself as the ultimate foundation of knowledge. Psalm 36:9 says, for with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Our minds are illuminated. by the very revelation of God. Without God revealing himself to us, we can't know anything. C.S. Lewis made a similar point when he said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. God's revelation to man is like the sunrise that illuminates the whole earth so that we can see clearly. Cornelius, I'm trying to talk too fast here. Cornelius Van TIl, he also offered quite a bit of thought on this very subject. Van TIl emphasized the I am part of the statement. Like the I think, therefore I am. Van TIl kind of focused on the I am part of it by going to scripture and showing that God says I am. And he says that in one of the most powerful examples of how God reveals himself to man. Van TIl says, for man's self-conscious presupposes God's self-conscious. For man, basically, to have a conscience, or to not a conscience, but to be self-conscious, it has to presuppose God's consciousness. God is the necessary precondition for consciousness. For man to be self-conscious, he must first be conscious of God, whether he concedes that point or not. And he says that in the defense of the faith. Now, this is one of the main ideas that he is expressing in his transcendental argumentation. He said about a transcendental argument, a truly transcendental argument takes any fact of experience which it wishes to investigate and tries to determine what the presuppositions of such a fact must be in order to make it what it is. He argues that Christian apologetics must be transcendental, which means that the argument must ask what must be true in order for knowledge, logic, morality, or science or to be possible. So in response to Descartes, Van TIl says, for Descartes' formula, I think, therefore I am, we now substitute God thinks, therefore I am. The actuality of God's existence is the presupposition of the intelligibility of the concept of possibility and probability, and that is from Christian theistic evidences. God thinks, therefore I am, is saying that my existence is dependent on and grounded in the mind and will of God, not my own thoughts or awareness. This is there's probably more to break down on that issue, but I have to basically move on for time's sake. The foundation has been laid, though, so enough. I think the foundation's been laid enough for a good understanding of the critique. Now, the second example I want to move on to is a very popular philosophical question attributed to the 18th century Anglo-Irish philosopher George Berkley. I think I'm saying that right. Maybe not, but it's not all that important. Now, the question goes like this. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Berkley was an idealist who said, to be is to be perceived. He argued that objects only exist when they are perceived by a conscious mind. And so in his mind, the sound of a falling tree wouldn't be heard or exist unless someone or something else with a conscious mind was there to perceive it. Now, Berkley apparently considered himself a Christian, but was also an immaterialist. God's omnipresent perception preserves the world when no human observer is present. I personally don't think that aligns with biblical teaching. We clearly live in a material world in reality that God created. Reality is rooted in God himself. I don't know much about him personally. That's just kind of a side note on being an immaterialist as a Christian. But I don't know how he kind of reconciles those two things. But this dictum or philosophical question is a matter of perception versus reality. Also, the nature of sound and epistemology. So reality is grounded in God. God creates reality, and again, is the necessary precondition for all things. Does the tree make a sound? Yes, it makes a sound because God hears it. Reality doesn't depend on human perception, but on God's absolute being and knowledge. You know, God is there, and he hears it. If he wants to make the argument that there has to be a conscious mind there to hear it, well, God's everywhere, so he hears it. But God, again, he's omnipresent and omniscient, which means that there is no place on earth that exists where there isn't truly nobody there, if that makes sense. There's not a place on earth where God isn't. So there's always somebody there. A tree falling, in the sound it makes, the laws of physics, induction, and uniformity of nature all exist and operate the way that they do because God sustains them. He gives them meaning and he upholds the universe. So the question presupposes that the tree fell, right? So it says if a tree falls in the woods, so that's presupposing that the tree fell. The question is about the tree making a sound. But if no one is there, then, according to Berkley, did the tree even fall? Because if there wasn't a conscious mind there, then how did the tree fall if it wasn't being perceived to have fallen? So did it even really fall? Well, the question, again, presupposes that it did fall. So if we know that the tree fell, as per the question, then we know it made a sound. It can't follow the laws of gravity and not the laws governing sound waves. So the question affirms the natural law of gravity, but questions the natural laws governing sound. If it obeyed physics when it fell, then surely it obeyed other natural laws afterward. Now, how can we know this? As a Christian, I can make sense of these laws. These laws assume induction. What is that? That's basically the idea that the future will be like the past. And it also it assumes uniformity of nature, that nature is ordered in a specific way, that the laws of nature are consistent and constant over space and time. Genesis 8:22 says, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So God upholds the universe and all the laws therein. A tree falling every time it's cut down makes sense in a Christian worldview. The tree making a sound when it falls every time makes sense in a Christian worldview. It doesn't make sense in the naturalistic worldview because the naturalistic worldview can't ground laws, since anything that happens is just matter acting over space and time. If nothing is governing those things, then we have no reason to believe that the future will be like the past. Maybe the tree won't fall this time because nothing is governing it to follow the laws of gravity the same way that it has in the past. Maybe it won't make sound this time for the same reasons. A tree, or anything for that matter, following natural laws can only be grounded in Christian God, who sustains, governs, rules over, and orders the universe in such a way for it to be consistent. And so I believe personally, the biblical view of epistemology is the only view that can truly ground reality. Starting with God is the only way to make sense of everything: logic, reason, induction, uniformity of nature, morality, natural immaterial laws. Ultimately, the gospel, which is that we are fallen and sinful creatures and in need of a savior, who is Jesus Christ. So again, there's so much more that could really be unpacked here. Talking about induction and uniformity of nature, natural laws, all these different things. There's a lot more that can be said. I think there's always something that could be said about this. It's such an interesting topic, and it just gets so deep. But for brevity's sake, and for my own time's sake, because I have other things going on. This is not my full-time job. I can't do this full-time. I am a father and a husband, and the kids are off school right now, and I'm watching them and making sure that they stay alive and stay active. And I just have a bunch of other things going on too. Gotta make sure I try to take care of my body and work out, be a good steward of the things that God's given me. So sometimes some of these episodes are shorter than others, and that's just dependent on what else I got going on during the day. So, but I do think that I covered a good bit today, and I've rambled long enough. So I've given you a good bit to think about. And so, as always, brothers and sisters, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And to, not to, I'm really having a hard time just talking in general today, but just remember, that's the word I was looking for. Remember to always be able to give a reason for the hope that is in you, and to do it lovingly and with gentleness and reverence. So thanks again for watching and listening. I'll see you next time. All right.